Well, this Saturday did see fewer clashes than last week. And listening to that press conference with me is our international affairs editor, Douglas Herbert. Doug, hello. What did you make of that?
I think the French government is breathing a big sigh of relief this evening. They had warned on the eve of this of these demonstrations of what they said could be feared great violence, perhaps matching or even surpassing what we had seen last Saturday here in Paris, when it was the worst urban rioting that the country's really seen in decades. You have to go back to 1968, May 1968. So there was really a sense of watching and waiting with bated breath, hoping against hope, if you were in the government, that it wasn't going to be overtly more violent than the week before. There was a massive rethink of police strategy this time around. Tens of thousands of more police deployed across France, but also more in Paris itself, and also bringing in more sort of military hardware, almost in a sense, not tanks, but armored vehicles, which really unseen in many, many years in Paris, borrowing them from the National Gendarmerie, which is one of the two sort of national police forces in France. So just seeing them on the streets, that showed a whole new strategy here. I think the government has been, in a sense, listening to their words. You come away with the sense there's a bit of they've been chastened. I don't think they think,
the tone was definitely chastened.
The tone was chastened in the sense of it's not, okay, done and dusted, we can now get on with it. It wasn't as bad as we expected. They're cognizant of the fact, that there is still, as they said, demonstrations continuing. And I was even seeing going on in the Twitter sphere while he was speaking, some people saying that out in the provinces things are far from under control. In towns like Toulouse, there's still relatively there's some random acts of people going around causing disorder. So it's not under control, but it's much more under control than it had been a few hours ago, and it looks like things are winding down, at least here in the capital. They said, though, the dialogue has started, and the dialogue must continue, and I think this is going to be the next big next step. And this is because it might be situation under control tonight, but this is a spark that could flare up again. I think the government is very cognizant of that. I think they know that if they take a misstep, or if there's no follow-through in this, or if they just throw out a few symbolic measures, a few scraps, so to speak, that the Yellow Vests, they're very much there. If the government and the police are vigilant, you can bet that the Yellow Vest protesters are also vigilant. They are going to be very closely scrutinizing, watching, waiting. They're not going to let the government simply walk away from this and hope it all blows over and dies down. And I think on both sides, there's a sense of right now feeling the other one out, sort of trying to get a sense of where they're going and taking each side at its word right now. So we're going to be waiting, obviously, in the next couple of days for Emmanuel Macron himself to speak. He has been notably silent, and yet he is the one that has really been in the crosshairs of this movement, not the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe. He's been the micromanager. He's been the one delegated to handle the day-to-day crisis management. It is Emmanuel Macron that the people want to hear from. It's Emmanuel Macron that the people want to see a change in his attitude, because it's not simply Emmanuel Macron's policies which have riled up these protesters. It's also his tone. It's his presidential image. It's how he projects himself. And people will be looking very closely in the coming days when he does address the French nation for a change in tone and a sort of sense that he, too, has been chastened by these events.
And that's perhaps the key, because when they say that it's time now for dialogue, the issue hasn't changed. How do you talk to such a complex group of people?
How do you do it? There had been a lot of this was organized over social media via Facebook posts. Some of it also fueled by misinformation, disinformation, conflicting information. There were almost as many, you could sometimes say, points of view among the Gilets jaunes as there were Gilets jaunes, yellow vests. They did not always speak in a unified voice. The one thing uniting them was a sense of absolute anger, resentment, and a sense that they do not want to continue with business as usual in terms of the economic and social policies that they feel have been imposed on them by a very distant central power, central authority here in Paris. That is one thing they can agree on. As far as right now, what their agenda is going to be going forward, I said there was something circulating on Facebook. It was a list of 25 demands of the Gilets jaunes, and it was called, the official list of demands. But, It wasn't an official list insofar as this was not an official movement. There was no leader. It was never politically affiliated. The irony being Emmanuel Macron himself swept to power on a movement that was never really a political party. It was unaffiliated, so to speak. It was a broad-based movement. So they shared that in common, ironically. But right now, they are going to, it's definitely moved beyond the tax rise demands. They are going to be looking for demands basically to raise living standards. They basically want to be able to live better. The thing that almost all of them will tell you is they don't just want to survive. They want to be able to live their lives. They want to be able to live with dignity. They don't want to reach the 20th or the 21st of the month, a lot of the time when their paycheck, runs out, and have absolutely nothing to tide them over for the remaining parts of the month in terms of not being able to do anything to enjoy their lives, just trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel to pay their bills. That's what they're going to be looking for right now. And that's going to remain the crux of their demands. They're going to be looking for relief by way of tax relief, and they're going to be looking for relief by way of when it finally gets there. Obviously, the fuel tax hike, gas and electricity prices, and beyond that, I think they're going to be looking for signs that the government has really gotten it, that they got the message loud and clear, that these people may live remote and far from Paris. They may not be, living within the greater Paris region, and they may not always be front and center on the radar of the government agenda. But they are very much going to let the government know that they're not going away, and they want their concerns to be addressed. I'll just say one last thing. The moderate protesters, even the moderate ones, we're not talking about the radical fringe, we're not talking about the violent fringe. The moderate ones, a lot of them are still calling for dissolution of the National Assembly, of the lower house of Parliament, and calling for the resignation of Emmanuel Macron. Does that mean any of that's going to happen? Unlikely, perhaps, at this point, but that just gives you a sense. These are the moderate parts of the movement. So it shows that their demands remain very much front and center, and they are not going to drop those demands. They remain very, very, very strict demands, very serious demands, and this government's not off the hook by a long shot.
And let me just ask you one last question. We've seen that there were fewer clashes this Saturday, that the violence was relatively less worrying than what we saw last week. Relatively. Yes. And again, once again, this is Paris. These are pockets of violence in Paris. Right. Isn't the whole of the country. Right. We heard two numbers there from the Interior Minister. One of them was 1,385 people arrested. That number, he said, is likely to go up. The other number is 125,000 yellow vest protesters. Does that mean that today was a success for both sides, and that perhaps that kind of makes a more positive backdrop for discussions going forward? You
could say that it was a victory for both sides, because the vast majority of the yellow vest protesters were peaceful, and the vast majority of them made it known. And they've been, a lot of them, spokespeople for the movement or self-appointed spokespeople, have been going on French television networks all throughout the week talking about they are not about violence. They do not espouse the aims of those who have been the small minority that was violent last weekend. All they want to do is be able to protest peacefully to get their demands across. 125,000 in the realm of things, when you hear about over 1,000 arrests, 1,300 arrests, yes, that is a record high, I believe, in one day in Paris of arrests in protests. However, given the fact that 125,000 were out on the street, that does stand that it was, by and large, a peaceful movement today. By and large, people going out there to protest and to make their voice heard, which they did. I will also say that on the social media, you're already hearing people saying, if the government's acknowledging 125,000, the real figure of people out there is probably quite a bit higher, maybe even 2 to 3 times higher. Police estimates and government estimates always tend to be very conservative to the bottom range. The organizers usually have it at a higher range. My hunch is it's somewhere probably in between what the yellow vests are going to say and what the government says. But even if 125,000 at the conservative estimate, that's a lot of protesters out on the street across France.
Douglas Herbert, thank you very much for that.